Good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Some of those who may not know me want to let you know I've been actually working and traveling many roads in Africa over the last decades. When I was a young student in the age of 19, I traveled from Cape Town to Cairo, so I'm quite connected to the continent. I'm living there now in Nairobi with my family for the last years. And what I'll present to you now is some work I did with our chief economist, Shanta Devarajan, on Africa's emergence and the implications for the aid architecture, or as Shayla put it, the road to middle income. So let me highlight you first the main message, and there's three main messages of this presentation. The first is Africa is actually starting to catch up. You notice those, if you're observers of the news, next week IBM will launch its big international Africa lab in Nairobi. A lot of exciting news of Africa's emergence. Very different than when I traveled the continent 25 years ago. But it's a recovery, it's a rebound, much more than big economic transformation. That's yet to come. Now, why did this rebound, why is it happening? And we see four factors, and you could call it also the why factor because everything rhymes on the why. Demography, geography, technology, and policy. And I'll show you some illustrations of those whys and the why factor. And then if Africa emerges and grows, as Asia has been doing in other parts of the world over the last decades, will have a big implication how international partners relate to Africa, especially the role of aid will be probably a different one. And my last blog was actually on this topic, which you can see on the Africa Can website of Shanta Devarajan, where I'm a contributor as well. So let me walk you through Africa's emergence that you see in many sectors and many types of countries. And so first, for those of you who have the long-term perspective on Africa, say since independence, you can actually organize Africa's development and growth story in three distinct episodes. The first episode was until the oil shock, when Africa grew about the same level as the rest of Africa. The second period was since the oil shock, when Africa was below the international average, and actually the two long last decades. And then since then, you get Africa's emergence and recovery when actually Africa was growing above the world average, which this chart is showing and telling that the Africa line, which is the light black line, is actually above the very thick black line, which is the world average. And above that, you still have the bit stronger performance of developing countries as a whole, especially Asia. But you see the gap is narrowing, and Africa is soon, in that sense, like Asia. So the next slide shows you what you could call the African ride to middle income. And this is now the map of Africa today. And what I'll do now is I'll walk you through the groups of countries that you see in Africa. And we categorized it, again, in a clear-cut way in several types of mix. So it's Africa's mix with an MIC, Africa's middle-income countries. But you could also associate it as Africa's mix, the broad mix of countries. So the first gray block is mainly Southern Africa. And it has a number of very small countries that you can't see well on the map, Seychelles being one of them, Mauritius, Cape Verde. Those are mature mix, countries that you associate with middle income status, better infrastructure, a certain industrial base, and more modern countries that clearly have been there for a while. The second group of Africa's mix is the oil, the commodity mix. So it's those countries that have become rich, sometimes overnight, because they found oil or have other types of natural resources. These countries have very different policy issues and challenges. Often it's still a very high poverty, but notionally they are rich, and clearly they'll have a different relationship to aid, which I'll come to later. The third group of countries, you could call them new mix. So that's many of them Western Africa, countries like Senegal, Mauritania, also Nigeria, Cameroon, that have had some sluggish periods in their past, but just have had some degree of stability that let them grow into this middle income status. So if you add all of those countries up now, and that's a quiz you can do with your friends, ask them how many middle income countries are there in Africa, I bet very few would say 22. That's the number now. So 22 of these countries are now notionally above $1,000 per capita, which is the World Bank's threshold of middle income. Still very poor by international standards. Many of these countries have even big poverty, but a very, very different Africa than I knew when I was traveling in the continent more than 20 years ago. Then what we did is to project forward the next 10, 15 years until 2025, then you see the next mix. That would include the countries that I live in now, Kenya, but as well as Mozambique and other countries where natural resources were found. So that means if you then add some countries that could possibly make it with a high growth momentum, which are also in various parts of Africa, you get a very different Africa map. If you look at the yellow parts that are left now, it is just a small portion of Africa that would be what we call low income. And many of those countries are actually countries that are fragile, that are affected by conflict. So that again will change a lot how we'll see the continent and how we will interact with it. So this is our Africa's right to income map and illustration. And actually I have a tweet on this, so if you like this, just look it up and go for it. Linked to this now is some work that Homi Karas at Brookings has done, with whom I edited also a book, and his main point is that today, we may be exactly in the year that more poor people live in fragile countries compared to stable countries. That's the crossover that you see between the blue line and the yellowish brown line. That's 2012, 2013, when we see a situation of still 1 billion poor people, the bottom billion, but half of those poor are in fragile states. And the line for fragile states doesn't move much. People in fragile states are most affected by poverty and are in deepest poverty traps. Poor people in stable countries have a much more potential future to get out of poverty, and you see that over the next decade, if this analysis holds, that most of the question of low income, of poverty, will be more and more in fragile states and not in stable states. So let me move now to what drove this emergence, which is very diverse across those clusters of countries, and go to the Y factor: demography, geography, technology, and policy. Now, Africa's population is rising rapidly. Africa is adding 27 million people every year. It's the fastest rising continent in the world, and most people think this is dramatically negative and creates a lot of challenges. And they're partially right, because it creates a very different perspective on African cities, African countries, and African challenges. However, one aspect I'd like to leave you with is that it is a very fundamentally different type of population growth that we see now than in the past. The numbers may be the same. For my country I'm living in now, Kenya, is quite simple. It's 1 million every year, has been the last 20 years, will be the next 20 years, 1 million. But, that's a big but, this 1 million is mainly adults and is mainly in urban areas. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because, fortunately, children survive with bigger likelihood, people live longer, and they have fewer children. So you get population growth with fewer children. And that's a very good thing in principle. It's an opportunity, a demographic opportunity. It's called demographic dividend. And you see it in this chart in the opening up of the blue line and the red line. Most of the total growth in Africa, that rapid growth, is driven by adults. And children are still growing, but not the same scale. If you have more adults taking care of fewer children, you get more savings, you get more investment per child, and get the opportunity for them to have then a better life than their parents. That's the demographic opportunity, but that needs to be reaped, and I come to this in a minute. Now, on a global scale, for me being European, it's quite fascinating because you see big shifts in the continent. When I was born in the early 70s, you had 2 Europeans per 1 African. When I retire in 2030, there'll be 2 Africans for 1 European. A dramatic shift in how continents' population size have performing. The rest of the continents globally stay actually roughly at the same levels. Asia is about 60% of the global population over 100 years, 1950 to 250. The Americas are around 10%, also over 100 years. It's just Africa and Europe which are switching, and switching big time. That's the blue line and the green line that you'll see here. Now, with more people and the same space, what you get is more density. That also is called, or part of that is urbanization. So the world is urbanizing. More than half of the world's population lives in cities. And Africa is urbanizing too, like the rest of the world. That's the red block that you see moving up, and you see also the world dotted line being above that. And it's actually going very symmetrically. Everybody moves towards more urbanization. And it's not just driven by migration, by children moving out of their rural areas into cities. That's part of the story. But it is also that villages are becoming cities because there are more people. And that itself, again, creates an opportunity. No guarantee for development, but a big opportunity for development, because no country has ever grown rich without many cities. You need cities to grow. Cities are the growth engines in every country in the world, and that's again an opportunity for Africa if it is managed well. Last but not least, on demography and geography, you can see how this plays out in the country I live in now, Kenya, where you see quite rapid population growth, the 1 million people a year, doubling the population from 40 million now to 80 million by 2045. But it is the red part, the urban part, that grows fastest. And you'll see actually a tipping point in 2033 where Kenya will be majority urban, and then the rural population will actually decline not just as a share but in absolute numbers. Again, because many of those villages and small cities are becoming bigger and become agglomerations. Now let me go to technology, and as a wide field, I'll just give you one slide and one message, which is about cell phones, which is the strongest association with technology. And that's truly a revolution that happened in Africa in a very short period of time. 10 years ago, except in South Africa, nobody except the very, very rich had a cell phone. Today, everybody has it, including the most poorest of the poor. And at this stage, with a cell phone costing $5 on the second-hand market and a SIM card that you can almost get for free, you still need to come make calls. And you can get calls, though you can be connected to the world in a way that has not happened before, and led to a lot of innovations, including mobile money called M-Pesa in Kenya. And that we're just seeing that wave to unfold. And as I mentioned at the beginning, just to give you another symbol there, IBM, one of the global biggest companies in general, is now opening their big innovation hub in Nairobi next week. Last part of the why factor is policy. The World Bank does measure policy performance of every country we work in every year. That's actually online available, these ratings called CPIA, Country Performance and Institutional Assessment. And what you see here in this chart is actually higher numbers are better. So if you move up, it's good. And so Africa, which is red, moves up from a low medium ranking of 2006 to one which is higher now at 3.5. The key point is it is now the same as the rest of the world we work in. So African macroeconomic performance, macroeconomic policies, those things that you associate with the debt crisis in Europe. Africa is the same now as the world average, which is a very good news, and it's one of the reasons why Africa's economic environment has been improving. Put it that way, very simply, if you take any African country except Zimbabwe and change it with Greece, you wouldn't have a euro crisis in the world. You would actually have stable macroeconomic performance, which is another message that now northern countries can learn from the south on macro management, because many of those countries did it very well, including Kenya, especially during the global financial crisis. Now, having said that, though, not everything is gloom, and there's many areas where things don't go extremely well, and governance is an area where Africa is stagnating, and the gap to other parts of the world is opening up. So governance is not just corruption, there are many other subsets. In some areas are slightly improving, like public financial management, but the fundamental governance challenges in Africa are still, according to our assessments, similar to the status they were 6 years ago. Last but not least, and that was one of the main messages you saw at the beginning, is that economic transformation, again visualized in China with these enormous factories and people moving out of agriculture into industrial production, is not happening in Africa. There's actually countries which, where the industrial share of GDP, the share that of people working in factories, declines. Kenya and South Africa among them. One way to also think about this is in exports. You have to be strong in exports if you want to be a successful economy, especially if you're small and medium-sized, as most African countries are. Kenya's share in exports has declined, as you see from this chart, from 38% to 25% now, while in other countries in the world, in Asia, competitors, not the richest countries in Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, have grown their share in exports from the same level as Kenya or below to something that is more than double today. So that is the big next agenda. How do you not just energize some of Africa's services and have move people from rural poverty to some urban poverty, but into factories? Now, let me come to the last part of the presentation, which is very much linked to what the World Bank also stands for, and many of our international partners, is how do you deliver aid in this new environment that Africa is in and will be in even more over the next years. And there's a book that I'm associated with, but many others, it's called Delivering Aid Differently. And I'd like to walk you through now a few ideas how one can deliver aid differently in this environment. Now, just to start with, give you a very simple illustration how aid, or the so-called aid architecture, used to work in the past. Well, you had people in rich countries, and they are on average relatively rich, so it's the rich and the middle class and those who pay taxes in the rich countries. They pay taxes to their governments, and these governments allocate a share of their budget to aid, and they give it to either international organizations like the World Bank, like the UN, like the EU, or they give it directly to the governments. And then these governments in poor countries, then they try to give money to their poor people. Well, that was a simple model. As we all know, it didn't always work in that straightforward way, and many elements of these chains had some challenges. But the main point I'd like to make now is that if you take this visual now and compare it with how the aid architecture looks today, it's very, very different. It's a much more complex field of players and actors, much more direct relationships, also with a lot of philanthropy that people are giving directly and having direct relations, but also a lot of NGOs now becoming big players. You have the vertical funds, and you have several hundreds now of multilateral organizations alone. So much more complex field, but still a growth field. I'll come to this in my next slide. Aid is still growing in the world. That's the good news. It's not growing dramatically. It's growing roughly with the world average growth. So it doubled in nominal terms from the early 90s, from roughly 100 billion to 200 billion a few years ago. That's about, in real terms, if you remove inflation, 50% increase. So you have a portfolio of $200 billion a year, so quite sizable. The key point is, and this is the colors in the slide, is the blue part, well, still the big one, ODA, Official Development Assistance. That's what the Britons, the Americas, the Japanese, the Germans, and the World Banks of this world do, or stand for. But it's the red and the green part that's growing most. The red part being the NGOs, and people like Bill Gates obviously are one of the poster childs of this movement, but also new bilaterals, China, Gulf states, and other previously poor countries entering the field as well. So they're driving the growth. They're making this whole environment more complex, but also more fascinating, with more innovations and more opportunities that you can take from that? So take from that home, it's a very different landscape with many more actors, many more projects, but still a need, we would argue, for somebody who tries to stay on top to have an overall picture of this complicated landscape. Now, part of that story, part of the challenge, and if you think of you think of the opportunities of that new landscape, one is innovation. You just have many more activities going on and you can try to test out new ideas. That's the plus. The minus is fragmentation. So plus innovation minus fragmentation. Fragmentation means a lot of small projects happening, and it's very difficult for a government, many of them having not so many senior officials who can navigate through this international labyrinth, to be absorbed by all these many new players and new projects, many of them small. And that's the main message of this chart, that even if you take the traditional players, the blue part of the pie of the previous chart, you see that their actually project size is declining, even though project numbers are increasing dramatically. Project numbers have increased from 20,000 in the mid-90s to 80,000 now. But project size declined from 6 million to 2 million now. So that's paradoxical, especially the traditional bigger players. We argue in this book it should do big things, because there's many others who do small projects. So one message to your governments, if you live in Europe, the US or Japan, they should think big. They should do big things, because that's what they're known for. There's so many others who can do the more innovative grassroots, smaller scale activities. We're closely coming to the end, so let me just highlight you what the overall, how you can bring all of this together. And one way to do this is to think of the types of countries that international partners are engaging with. And here are 4 types of countries. You have the fragile states, stable countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And traditionally, in the past, well, the focus was on the stable poor country. The, I guess Cambodia after the war, the Tanzanias of this world, that's what the focus was. Now, the message is, as I showed you before, that those countries, fortunately, will start to disappear because they will move into middle income if they stay stable. So that's the good news. There's still a big engagement in middle income countries, obviously China, Indonesia, South Africa, of those countries, many in the Middle East, where there's still a lot of poor people. And some argue actually most of the poor now live in middle income countries, but because these countries have been growing and you have inequality, the middle class and the rich are now bringing the country as a whole above the line, but not many of their millions of people. So that's a second big engagement. But there again, the message is, as with any other African MIG country, these countries don't need aid as money, but they may need aid as knowledge, as a way to help their own systems to work better, because aid is always too small in those big middle-income countries or these richer countries. And then the engagement in the past in fragile and in high-income country are quite small. Now, and I think that's one of the last slides I have, is how will this look in the future? And the future then looks very different. It looks that stable poor engagements will go down, middle income will probably stay stable, but the engagement in fragile states will go up dramatically, because that's where the last challenge for the poor in this world is. And that's at least a discussion now in many institutions, including the World Bank, giving some high-income countries like Greece are in trouble, that actually those can even learn from international experience. So Greece should be able to learn from Korea's management of the Asia financial crisis, or from many other innovations that happen now in the South. So you could even see a more balanced approach across all countries in the world, however with an emphasis on the fragile countries. So that brings me to an end. You'll see my email and my Twitter account. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.